Summer 1990. A teenage boy in trouble. An evil that only comes out at night. Only a straight-to VHS movie can save him. From A. Kelley, the author of Beware the Night. Bad Dreams. A thrilling horror novel, now available on Amazon. Rated PG-13, for some thematic elements and mild violence.
You are listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Welcome to this new episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast. I'm your host, AK, and this is another pocket edition of the podcast, which means that this is a shorter episode, but it has all the things you've come to love about the podcast. So let's begin. What makes a movie a classic? Is it the theme, the script, the directing, the acting? Some movies are called classics just because they have been around for decades and have gained enough cultural cachet for them to be deemed classics by influential critics or writers or opinion leaders. But the more I delve into this topic, the more I discover how tenuous the term classic really is. Take Citizen Kane, for example. It is considered by almost every movie buff and every respected film critic the greatest movie ever made. But I've never really met anyone who actually enjoyed watching Citizen Kane. Personally, the first time I watched it, I think was almost 20 years ago or 15 years ago. A friend of mine told me that he had a copy of it, a VHS copy of it, and he considered it the greatest movie ever made. And I asked him why he had that opinion, and I think he told me that that's what everyone said about Citizen Kane, or that some professor told him about it, in a film class. So I borrowed the VHS copy of Citizen Kane and watched it, and of course at the time I wasn't really as versed as I am now in film history and film studies, and but I had made a couple of short films at the time, so I knew a little bit about filmmaking, and I had read some books about film, and of course I had come across pieces written about Citizen Kane and several books about film history and film studies. But the first time I watched Citizen Kane, I felt that it wasn't really very entertaining to watch. And as I watched more movies later on and delved deeper into film history and what cinema really is about, I discovered personally that the greater the movie is, the easier it is. Not easier, maybe this is not the best way to put it, but I discovered that great movies, for the most part, maybe with a few exceptions from the silent film era, or films that go on for too long, like, over 3 hours, but most movies that are considered great, that I liked, are enjoyable. Some of them are even fun to watch. But Citizen Kane never really, moved me. in any way. The more I watched it and the more I studied it, I understood what people were saying. People who understood film and were interested in film history, of course, that technically it was groundbreaking in many ways, with Orson Welles, of course, ever the illusionist and ever the cinema magician, using every movie trick available to him at the time to make Citizen Kane. And on that level, of course, it's groundbreaking, and he pioneered a lot of, not really techniques, but he pioneered the use of these techniques in a way that maybe hadn't been used like that before. But as a piece of storytelling, Citizen Kane is just arguably far from flawless. The acting, across, the whole movie from most of the cast is just so melodramatic, and Orson Welles was such a humorless actor, and he was, of course, a very egotistical filmmaker and a very egotistical person, and that came across, on the screen, and his performance is just boring, to be honest. And the film itself is so heavy-handed in many places. I think the movie is considered a classic and is so revered more for its political posturing and technical razzle-dazzle than for any real storytelling merit, as is the case with most of the films of Orson Welles. Also, A Touch of Evil, a film that's considered also one of the greatest films ever made. And again, technically, there are some things in that movie that are just great, but again, A Touch of Evil isn't that great in terms of performances and storytelling, and all of Welles's projects are just so bloated and so heavy-handed. So again, it circles back to what I was saying about the idea of what makes a movie a classic. I think that movies age in different ways, and the more a movie follows a theme considered hot or topical at the time it was made, the more that movie is bound to age quicker than other movies that don't really pay attention to the cultural moods of the time. Consider most of the films made in the late 1960s and throughout the 70s. Films like Dog Day Afternoon, Bonnie and Clyde, The Conversation, and The Parallax View. These movies were considered explosive at the time for their countercultural stance and more or less in-your-face politics and an approach. But most of these films really haven't aged well, coming off as emotionally overheated and intellectually not very impressive, to be honest. Critic Leonard Maltin described Dog Day Afternoon as a movie that is basically much ado about nothing. And in many ways, he's right. Take away the great performances and rousing street scenes featuring Al Pacino, roiling up the crowds, and you get an overlong and somewhat, story that goes nowhere. And aside from Chris Sarandon's character, a very sympathetic character, and his performance in that movie was great. But aside from that character, the main characters in the movie are just not very likable. But there are movies from that era, the 1960s and the 1970s, that have aged very well. Movies like 1972's The Candidate, starring Robert Redford, one of my all-time favorite filmmakers. The Candidate is as timely as ever and remains one of the most intelligent movies ever made about politics and political corruption. And of course, The Godfather, also from 1972, seems to get better with age, I think. Another example are the films of John Carpenter, a brilliant technician and a royally subversive filmmaker. Many of his themes of, corrupt churches and corrupt clergymen, and a topic he's really, obsessed with, greed, nihilism, and anti-heroes. They are all themes that still resonate to this day, for better or for worse. But as he himself has admitted on many occasions, his lack of interest in costume design and in several, details of design and art direction, this lack of interest in these details makes his movies age much more than they should, considering Carpenter's neoclassical visual style and mastery of the technical aspects of filmmaking, and of course his storytelling talent as well, because Carpenter's movies, for the most part, with the exception of maybe They Live, which is way over the top, and the tone of that movie is just way off, and it's I think Carpenter's most self-indulgent movie. But apart from They Live and maybe Prince of Darkness to some extent, and In the Mouth of Madness also, apart from these movies, Carpenter has always been a very efficient storyteller. But again, because of his lack of interest in the details of design, the hairstyles in his movies, and some of the costumes and in his movies, especially in the movies made in the 70s, with the bell bottoms and stuff like that, they make the movies age much more than they should, because the visuals don't really age. The filmmaking, for the most part, in most of Carpenter's movies, doesn't age. Sam Raimi, on the other hand, who's also a brilliant technician, and who kept growing as a filmmaker, because he started as with the Evil Dead movies, and maybe even up to his movie The Gift. He started as a razzle-dazzle kind of filmmaker like Orson Welles. He wasn't really a very good storyteller. His movies were on the chilly side, and you couldn't really relate to his characters. But just his technique and his filmmaking style, they were just amazing, and they never age. But also, because Raimi has said on several occasions that he actually pays attention to how his actors dress and to costume design, because he I think he said it in the Evil Dead Companion, which is a great book. He said that nothing is funnier than watching a movie and seeing the outdated, hairstyles and bell-bottom trousers and, things that were considered stylish at the time the movies were made. So he always paid attention to make his characters dress in a way that was as timeless as possible. And you can see it in his movies, even dating back to The Evil Dead, even though some of the technical aspects, especially the effects of a movie like The Evil Dead, have aged, but really the way his characters dress for the most part is timeless. With plaid shirts and jeans and things like that. So again, I think that contributes to what makes a movie age fairly well. And of course, all of that wouldn't count if other aspects of the filmmaking weren't good. But to make a classic, I think, or a movie that is timeless, I think filmmakers really have to watch these elements. Other movies age because simply their ideas or approach were dated from the get-go, like most of the action movies from the 1980s. For example, if you watch them now, with the exception of maybe many of the movies of Sylvester Stallone and some of the movies of Steven Seagal, most action movies made in the 80s, if you watch them now, they are just either silly or over the top, or their ideas are just, some of their ideas are even repulsive now. But I think what makes movies like Hitchcock's Vertigo, The Archers, The Red Shoes, and The Haunting, directed by Robert Wise, what makes these movies so timeless, what makes these movies classics, is that they were well written, dealt with timeless issues, and of course their makers knew their crafts inside out. I recently came upon an article in SLATE magazine called "Why Has the Second Coming of David E. Kelley Been Such a Quiet One?" In the article, the writer claims that though Kelley has made a comeback after being in semi-retirement for nearly a decade, his return to the small screen has been a quiet, somewhat unimpressive one. Personally, I beg to differ. As the creator of such hits in the 1990s and the 2000s as The Practice, Ally McBeal, Picket Fences, Boston Public, and Boston Legal, David E. Kelley was one of the most successful TV showrunners in history, and deservedly so, because Kelley basically revolutionized the TV legal drama with The Practice, which during most of its run was one of the best written and most entertaining TV shows to ever air on American television. If you watch The Practice, really, there was nothing like it, with the exception of the groundbreaking Canadian TV show Street Legal, which I think premiered in 1987. And then, of course, there was L.A. Law that came after it. But what Kelley did with The Practice was basically take the legal drama, and which up to that point, again with the exception of Street Legal and LA Law, up to that point the legal drama was either, you know, overly moralistic or, you know, adhered to a certain formula, and the characters in these dramas just weren't realistic. With the practice, Kelley did something very, very, you know, unique and groundbreaking in its way, is that he took the legal drama, added an element of moral ambiguity to it, made the characters realistic in many ways, but also made it very, 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 very watchable even to people who didn't really like legal dramas. He took the legal drama and made it something that was viable for primetime television, something that could be so entertaining, so thought-provoking, and in some ways, you know, sensational, because of course David E. Kelley always had the tendency to just go over the top every once in a while, but with the practice he just made legal dramas very smart, very realistic, very gritty, without making them off-putting. They always had this, you know, sheen to them that didn't really take away from the realistic aspects of the drama and the psychology of the characters, but his shows are always, you know, they always just shy away from being too off-putting or too, you know, repulsive. Because other dramas like maybe Homicide and NYPD Blue, which were also great shows in their own way, they just sometimes they pushed it too hard. They pushed the grittiness too hard that maybe they turned off some viewers. David E. Kelley never really did that, although he dealt with some really controversial and some really dark topics across all of his shows. He always had this unique ability to present them in a way that made them accessible to most viewers. And again, going back to the idea of David E. Kelley's comeback, the success of the practice really turned Kelley from a successful showrunner into a brand name, you know, producing one show after another with varying degrees of success. But for the most part, his signature style of wit, dark humor, and humanity made his shows so stylish, so groundbreaking, so singular. And he just, you know, made so many shows at the time. Ally McBeal again, and The Practice, and Boston Public, and Boston Legal, of course. But after the cancellation of Boston Legal, which was an uneven spin-off from The Practice, and in some ways it surpassed the Practice, but in many ways Boston Legal also showcased some of the worst tendencies of David E. Kelley, in that again he sometimes went too far in terms of sentimentality and in terms of, you know, soap boxing and preaching. But anyway, after the cancellation of Boston Legal, Kelley seemed to slow down, you know, producing another show very similar to Boston Legal in many ways, called Harry's Law, starring Kathy Bates. And he made a couple of shows after that, like The Crazy Ones with Robin Williams and Sarah Michelle Gellar. But none of the shows that he made after Boston Legal really, you know, had his touch, and he seemed not really interested in them. So he slowed down and he basically retired from show business after Boston Legal, and disappeared from the scene for several years. That is till he had a massive hit in 2017 with HBO's Big Little Lies, a great show, especially in its first season, and it was based on a popular novel, and it was just a huge hit critically and commercially. But that was considered his comeback. But in the strangely passive-aggressive slant article that I mentioned, the writer of the article seems to argue that Kelley's output since his comeback with Big Little Lies has been mostly underwhelming. Again, I disagree, because as a fan of Kelley's work, especially his legal dramas and many of his shows, including Picket Fences, I can honestly say that that assessment that shows that Kelley has made since his comeback aren't up to par, that assessment isn't entirely true. Because, for example, Kelley followed Big Little Lies with a show called Mr. Mercedes, and I think it premiered on DirecTV, I think. Mr. Mercedes was an adaptation of one of Stephen King's worst novels, but under Kelley's supervision, it became one of the best TV shows of 2017, taking King's lame plot and extremely unlikable and unrealistic characters and turning them into a moody, haunting, and brilliantly plotted series that played out like, a long-form movie, and was just amazing. I think the first season of Mr. Mercedes is just so underrated. And even if Kelley's voice wasn't as pronounced as in his shows from the 1990s, Mr. Mercedes still had this quirky, unique quality that only Kelley could deliver. And Mr. Mercedes lasted for 3 seasons. Season 1 was just a masterpiece. Season 2 was very uneven. Season 3 again was very good. And after that he made, of course, Big Little Lies Season 2, which was also a good show. Maybe not as good as the first season, but still the writing had some really bright spots. And yes, he made The Undoing last year for HBO, a show again which was based on a popular book, and a show that really began well, but it completely self-destructed, by the end of its run. But overall, I think that to say that Kelley's output since his comeback isn't up to par isn't fair, because at the moment Kelley is involved with more than 10 shows, including The Big Sky, which is a very big hit on network television, and he has, of course, his adaptation of 9 Perfect Strangers, and a lot of shows, on basically all the networks and all the streaming platforms. And I, for one, am so pleased that Kelley is back, because no one writes like Kelley, and I always look forward to watching any of his shows, even if that show didn't really turn out to be his best. His shows are always interesting, and he is a brilliant writer. I'd like to end this episode with a short clip from the opening track of Craig Safan's soundtrack to Lon Chaney's The Phantom of the Opera, which is out now. It is a great soundtrack and is a must for fans of the classic movie. and fans of Gothic cinema. So please listen to that clip. And again, thanks for listening, and please join me again on the Dark Fantastic podcast.
You've been listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.